23 million damage every ultimate, and this is on the not crit version. So if you built it on the crit version, all of that damage would be increased by about 25%. Greetings everyone. Today I will be going over how to build a character, Freyna edition. So first we have Freyna, and first we must go through the biggest issue that Freyna has. The biggest issue is that Trendsetter and the Academy are by far the best outfits for Freyna. However, Quarantine Clearance has definitely the best head. I would have to spend $30 to acquire the skin I want, a Greek tragedy. And then the second problem is her passive. Contagion links. For every enemy you have poisoned at a time, you get a stack of toxic skill power increase. 1, if the enemy dies, you lose your skill power increase. And 2, there's not a lot of ads to even use this inside of intercept bosses. So this would tell me off the bat that her kit is designed to kill ads, but honestly, you don't really need assistance in killing ads in this game. I think this passive needs to be massively changed. And I think her kit needs a little reworking because she seems a little weaker than other Descendants outside of the way that I built her. What this should do instead is this should be able to inflict multiple poison stacks on one enemy at a time, and you get max stacks at 15. That way you should be able to poison stack multiple ads at a time, and then you get the toxic skill power increase for the maximum poison stack you have inflicted on all of the enemies you have inflicted poison stacks on. Going down her line of skills, first we have Venom Trauma. Venom Trauma inflicts room 0 trauma on enemies, which is that little X symbol, poison and room 0 trauma. The second ability, Defense Mechanism. It gives you an armor, and any enemy that attacks you, either by shooting or slapping, is inflicted with both poison and room 0 trauma. I find this skill predominantly useless because the last thing you want to do is get slapped in the face by an ad. If you build Freyna for a whole bunch of health, you might be able to stand inside of a defense, having all of the enemies shoot at you, poisoning them all, and then they all die anyway. That is a possibility. Although I would not build a character like that because that would take a lot of slots and I wouldn't be able to do anything else with her except for stand in a field and get slapped by enemies, which is inherently not how I want to play this game. Although not a bad idea for a build. And then we have Putrid Venom. Putrid Venom lays down a poison puddle, and here you can see 2 debuffs. A skull debuff, which would be poison, and then another debuff called Venom Soaked. Venom Soaked is a debuff that whenever the enemies run around the map, they leave a whole bunch of footprints, poisoning other enemies, further hammering in an ad-killing build. And then she has Venom Babtism. Venom Babtism is a unique weapon where the ammo scales off of some of the modules equipped to the weapon that you transferred from. These include any buffs similar to Spray and Pray or Firing Fiesta, any fire rate up, and any rounds per magazine extra you have on the gun. This not only includes the module, but any fire rate and rounds per magazine rolls you have on the gun as well apply to the weapon, as far as I can tell. It will not scale. The higher the magazine is, the faster the fire weapon fires naturally. It only scales on fire rate bonuses, rounds per magazine bonuses, and anything like Spray and Pray or Firing Fiesta. The toxin removing debuff on Python seems to be effectively useless and provides you about a 2% damage increase. I wouldn't know the exact number on Python because my Python is at base. You get more stacks on a maxed out Python, but you cannot go higher than 80% on any attribute removing debuff. The maximum efficiency for effects that reduce toxin resistance is 80%, which means you cannot get higher than 80% resistance with the Python. I do have to say, the more resistant to toxic the enemy is, the more useful Python will be. Most likely you will see a highest return on something like the Devourer or the Swamp Walker with Python while using Freyna. Although if you're using Freyna against the Swamp Walker, you probably have a bad time anyway, but Swamp Walker isn't that bad. So why then do I recommend Secret Garden? Because it still increases the damage of your other skills. The good thing about the buff from Secret Garden is that it is a direct skill power amplifier, which means this is a real damage boost. It's not anything else if it were to go into base skill power boost ratio, because whenever you add things into multipliers themselves without increasing the base value, you don't get a true damage multiplier. And that's just how math works. So for this build, I have the Secret Garden, and the Perforator is my main damage dealing weapons, although I'm only using a weapon about half the time unless I'm out of mana, which is often, and we'll go into that into the build. On my Perforator, I prefer a weak point expansion, and that is because of damage cycles and how they work. So with the Perforator, I'm not getting a lot of sustained damage out of this build in particular, as the ultimate's cooldown, if I do it right, has 11 seconds on the cooldown, which means I only have about a 9-second damage window in between things I need to do and rolls I need to perform. In this damage window in between my ultimates, I will typically get off 1 to 2 weak point expansion shots. On a crit, it will do about 3.5 million damage. I plan to take this higher the more the gun evolves. So I recommend high burst damage in between damage cycles on the build. It doesn't matter if you have the Perforator or if you're using a sniper rifle or whatever, you'll get obviously more damage out of a well-built sniper rifle. Maybe I'll make a piercing light or afterglow video whenever I fully level up both of them. So that's it for the guns. For the external components, we have options. If you want to maximize your damage output, there is nothing better than the Slayer set. For anyone that's curious about what Toad means on the Slayer set, it's usually the abilities that pull enemies in, but it's not always the case. So for instance, Valby's unique ability inflicts Toad, and so does Lepic's traction grenade. Thank you, chat, in live stream. Other abilities do it too, but it's not centered around a single Descendant. I use the Slayer set because it gives me the most damage. However, you don't have to. A secondary build I would use for more survivability is a 2-part Venom Essence set. The Venom Essence comes with shield, and the processor comes with maximum hit points. So I would specifically choose those 2 units, so you get the 6% toxic skill power. The poison stack that you get from the Venom Essence isn't really worth it. I would rather just stack HP, specifically on Freyna, but all of the 2 pieces in this scenario I don't think will benefit you except for the Annihilator 2 pieces. However, they don't come with hit points. So I personally would just get the HP support sensor and memory unit if I cared more about survivability than I do about the Slayer set. On the Slayer set, what it does is it adds a 0.261 multiplier on your base skill power boost ratio inside of your damage multipliers. There are 4 modules for Freyna. Toxic Simulation is not worth it. Don't use it under basically any circumstances just because of how defense works in this game. I don't think it's worth wasting your mod slot on a defense module for your allies. Contagion is okay as long as you're inside of defense, but once again, you don't really need help. Ads pretty much die to a well-built anything, and if they're so resistant to toxic that they're not dying, Contagion will not help you anyway. Neurotoxin Synthesis, I do believe, is the best mod for almost every scenario. So if you want to switch between a boss damaging build and then an ad clearing build that does marginally better at ad clearing, level up the Neurotoxin. And I found the Venom Synthesis a better ad clearer than Contagion if you build it correctly, simply because you can replace Valby thing with Freyna's Venom Synthesis thing as long as you build for maximum range, a little bit of cooldown, and all the damage you can muster. I start with Neurotoxin Synthesis though, because it increases the damage of the Room 0 Trauma on Freyna's ultimate to 553 skill multiplier on Room 0 Trauma. So you just have to get this between 8 to 12 ticks. I recommend not going too far on duration because, as I learned in chat, if you go too far in duration, you will grief yourself, was the vernacular. And then honestly, these two, this ability You can use to stack damage on whatever you want to stack damage on in between your damage cycles on your ultimate. This ability is essentially we're going to use to just lower our cooldown because it's kind of useless. The reason this particular ability is useless is because A, it doesn't do enough damage to warrant anything. It doesn't protect you from enough damage to warrant anything. Damage from the toxic puddle of 1 overrides any amount of damage from the damage of the room trauma 0 on skill 2. So why even have it? Just make sure when you're activating your ultimate that you do not try to stack a room 0 trauma over the first ability. Whichever room 0 trauma hits first, that's the room 0 trauma that will happen. It doesn't just stack both. And no, you cannot use the ultimate's room trauma 0 and upkeep it with the first ability. That would be a buff that they could give to Freyna to just constantly have the room 0 trauma activated by using the first ability. That would make it really fun to play, but that's not how this game works. On to the build. We have focus on tech and focus on toxic because it does more damage than the master modules, and you'll need the skill cooldown. MP conversion because you're going to need maximum amount of cooldown that you can get on the build. So we have MP conversion, maximize conservation, and nimble fingers. The obvious 3 choices for cooldown. I have strong mentality here on this slot, but you can really use this slot to do more things with because I have 2 empty spaces on the build. Technically 3 because I don't have a leveled up spear and shield. And if you wanted to, you could go in and edit this build for more damage using crit. There is no crit on the build because I just don't want to build it that way. You would get more straight damage with critical, but you would lose utility. 1 and 3, I find myself capable of casting 1 and 3 far more often if I have some sort of skill cost on it. These 2 slots are so I can interchange duration and range if need be. I like range on my build, but only in certain scenarios. It's not good against every void intercept bosses, but it's good against gluttony. If your range is big enough, you can cast 3 in the center where gluttony stands, and he'll always be standing in a toxic puddle. Obviously, we have increased hit points because we don't want to die. I do recommend some sort of survival module on all of your builds, whether it be increased shields or increased hit points, depending on the kind of character you have. And then we have skill extension. You don't want more duration than 40%. And maximized duration does give us a negative, so I'm just not using that unless I have to. If you will see a fully casted ultimate, pay attention to the buff at the top of the screen. If I had more duration, I would have wasted that last little tick of room trauma. So instead of you're essentially wasting damage by increasing the amount of time on room trauma 0, because the first room trauma 0 would last so much longer that I wouldn't get 2 ticks out of a full ammo cycle unless I waited for it to disappear. Here we get 2 ticks of room trauma 0, perfect timing as long as we just hold down the trigger. So don't have more than 36.5% skill duration on your build, or you won't get a second room trauma tick with your final, wasting 8 ticks of 533 skill power or 3500 skill power. Then after maximizing your cooldown, you do have multi-talented. There's an issue with multi-talented on Freyna, and this part is important. So in order to get the cooldown on Freyna on the Dimension active skill, which is the only use that number 2 provides us, we cannot simply activate it and get the cooldown. If you see right here inside of the ability, that is the cooldown window of multi-talented. The reason this is important is because that cooldown window has to be activated when Freyna's ultimate move ends. So you have to activate the ultimate, and then in the last 5 seconds, now we have a 10-second cooldown on her ultimate. If we didn't do that, our cooldown would be 28 seconds. On some builds, multi-talented is overrated. I think it's overrated on the Sharon build because if you go from 3.7 seconds to 2 seconds, your damage isn't double, even though you think it would be. You can, if you press 1 while that buff is happening, it does not give them room trauma 0 because the game takes the first room trauma 0 tick and inflicts that on the boss. So you can activate this puddle. While they're standing in the puddle, they get 2 ticks of damage, 1 from poison and 1 from toxic swamp itself. So here we have the illustrious Pyromancer. He is weak to toxic. Activate your free ammo. The majority of all of these fights is just waiting for his immune phase to end. You can tank a couple hits with this with the increased HP, but you're not surviving a ton of damage. But I think the survivability is acceptable. Something that everyone should be aware of during this phase is the best time for you to let your allies get hits on. You time it right, you can get a very big damage phase off of that interval of time. Just so everyone knows, whenever you go to grapple something, it's better for your teammates if you don't just YOLO break the part. But the timing is kind of hard to get down, so go into private and practice the timing so that you can get the most amount of time. As far as my reactor goes, I have additional skill attack when attacking a Colossus and toxic skill power boost ratio. If I was to pick the optimal reactor for Freyna, it depends on the build. If I'm going for the build I have, I would definitely pick either tech skill power boost on the reactor and attack against Colossi. So I would really just replace the toxic skill power boost ratio with a tech power skill boost ratio, and then keep the additional skill attack when attacking Colossus. That would be my optimal reactor. For anyone that just cares about damage, you can take off skill extension, spear and shield, and strong mentality and reslot these 3 for skill crit. You want skill concentration and skill insight. And then for whichever one you would pick over emergency measures or front lines, after equipping skill insight and skill concentration, Freyna's hit rate will become 10 point something, and the hit damage will become 2.7-ish. So whichever one you want to do, I recommend doing extra crit damage because bigger numbers are more fun to see. And if you take off strong mentality, spear and shield, skill extension, you will see about a 23% increase in your damage. It would be more, but you're taking off the spear and shield for crit. Everything else is essentially mandatory on the build. If you just want to get rezzed by your tanks every 5 seconds, you could also take off increased hit points. And that is the build for Freyna. I did do this on a live stream every week. I will be doing a build that my Discord community votes on, but I go over the build at the beginning of the stream. If you're awake at 4 a.m. Coordinated Universal Time, UTC, you can catch me doing the build that everyone voted on. I will also cast the votes on Twitter, and then I'll take the numbers and then obviously pick the one that everyone voted on. I'll be streaming 3 times a week for the first Descendant, and I think I'll be streaming some other content as well. So if you're interested in that, my Twitch is in the description. And enjoy your builds, enjoy your game. You kids have fun. Peace out.